The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.
I'm going to be telling a story that takes place in the town of Chelm. And this story is called The Golem of Chelm, and it's by Mark Binder. The town of Chelm is a town of fools. Well, some people say it's a town of people who are very, very wise. But they're so wise that no one understands them and thinks them foolish. Anyway, in Chelm there are many different townsfolk, many different people. And they're all special. But one townsfolk in Chelm is different, even for Chelm standards, because you see, this individual is not what we would call, human. Yes, this individual is not human. This individual is a golem, a mythical creature made from inanimate objects and brought to life by a piece of paper with the name of God written on it that it uses as its tongue. And this story is how it was created, at least the first time. Long ago in the town of Chelm, there was a young rabbi, and it was the day before the first day of school, and on the first day of school, the children always played pranks on the rabbi. He remembered last year. Oh, it was horrible. As we all know, young rabbis live on coffee, and the children replaced his sugar dish with salt. So when he drank in his coffee, he couldn't think about it any longer, no. He asked every single person in Chelm to substitute for him, but everyone knew what that would involve, and everyone said no. Well, the rabbi was sitting in his study, and the rabbi had many interests. He was interested in mysticism and very interested in calligraphy. And as the young rabbi was sitting at his desk, he was reading. He was also looking over a letter, and he was also writing notes. He did many things at the same time, and what he was reading was very interesting, and he was distracted, so he didn't pay attention to what he was writing on the other piece of paper, and without realizing it, his mind wandered, and he drew a few pictures, and without even noticing it, he wrote the name of God. And the name of God has power, and he wrote it in beautiful, beautiful calligraphy. And next to it, he drew a goose, and he wrote a poem, and there was a horse, and eventually the paper was covered with doodles, and when the rabbi glanced at it, he thought it was just scrap now. So the young rabbi threw this paper, where all young rabbis throw important documents and scrap paper, into the laundry bin. And then he sat down and continued with his reading. But then he heard something. The rabbi looked over, but there was nothing there. He calmed himself. It was just his nerves. The first day of school was tomorrow. But then he heard it again, and he looked, and there was nothing there. He calmed himself, but then he heard it again. He knew he heard it, and he stood up and he looked. There must be a child in the classroom, but there was still nothing there. As he was about to sit down again, he saw that his laundry bin was shaking. And then, from the laundry bin arose a thing. He didn't know what it was. It was a thing. It was wearing the rabbi's gardening boots and his comfiest pair of pants that he wouldn't wear to a formal occasion, and it was wearing the rabbi's finest jacket with a torn shirt underneath it. And on top of its head was a hat that the rabbi's mother had given him, and the creature didn't have a head. It had a pillowcase with a tear in it that seemed to be where a mouth should be. And the rabbi screamed, and the creature screamed. And when the creature screamed, the rabbi saw that the creature's tongue was a piece of paper. And he saw that this was the paper he was writing on, and he saw the name of God on this paper. And he knew what this creature was. This creature was a golem, a mystical creature brought to life by the name of God, made from inanimate objects. And should this paper be destroyed, it would fall to the pieces that made it. And the rabbi looked at the golem and said, "You are a golem." And the golem looked at the rabbi and said, "You are a golem." Well, eventually they had it straightened out that the rabbi was in fact a rabbi, and the golem was in fact a mystical creature brought to life by a piece of paper. It was very, very simple when you don't think about it. Anyway, the rabbi realized that he had created the perfect substitute teacher. Well, the next day of school came, and the children all ran to the classroom, and they talked and laughed with each other, and then they decided to discuss the pranks that they were going to pull on the rabbi this year. And one child said that he had covered the chalkboard with wax so that when the rabbi tried to write, the chalk wouldn't stick. Another child laughed at this and said that he had placed a piece of stale matzah on the rabbi's chair so that when the rabbi sat down, it would break and get crumbs all over his fine attire. Well, another child scoffed at both of them, for he had found where the rabbi's lunch was, and he had replaced the meat in the rabbi's sandwich with an old dirty dish rag so that when the rabbi bit into it, the rabbi would be biting into who knows what. Well, they waited and waited, but the rabbi didn't show up, and it was getting late. The rabbi should be here by now. But then the door turned, and in walked something. It wasn't the rabbi. It wore the rabbi's clothes, but it was puffier than the rabbi and had a pillowcase for a head. And one child said, "Rabbi, wearing a pillowcase can't protect you from our pranks." And the creature turned and said, "Sheket," which means be quiet. So of course all the children were very quiet. And it didn't have the voice of the rabbi, so they knew it must be a substitute. Well, the substitute walked up to the chalkboard and all the children snickered. But the substitute seemed to reach inside its chest and pull out a towel, and it wiped off the chalkboard and then continued with the lesson. Well, later in the day, the substitute sat down on the chair, but the matzah didn't break because it seemed the substitute was too light to break the matzah. Well, that was boring. The children knew that there was one more prank, though, and it was the best of all. So they waited until lunch. And when lunch came, they all got their snacks and then watched as the substitute picked up his bag. And they watched as the substitute reached in and took out the sandwich. But the substitute didn't eat it. The substitute reached in the bag again and took out 2 dirty socks. And in horror, in stunned horror, the children watched as the substitute ate both dirty socks. And then the substitute looked at the class, opened up the sandwich, and took out the dirty dish towel. And the substitute smiled at the class and seemed to say, "Thank you." Now, who knows what the children may have learned were the dish towel dry, but no, the dish towel was dropped in a puddle on the way to school, and it was soaking wet. And when the golem ate it, the water ran on the paper, and the ink started to run, and the paper started to tear. And with the paper gone, the paper with the name of God written on it, the golem fell apart into the pieces that had created it. And the children screamed and ran from the classroom and ran home and told their parents, who ran to the school to see what was happening. And when they got there, all they saw was the rabbi sitting calmly at his desk, reading a book, with a pile of laundry in a corner. The rest of the school year was very uneventful. And the next year, on the first day of school, the rabbi was not nervous at all. The children, on the other hand, were rather nervous. And as for the golem of Chelm, well, he was destroyed once, but he'd be back again. Though that's a different story.
I recently went to a wedding in Clearwater, Florida. And as happens to me over and over, when you go somewhere, eventually the conversation meanders around to, "So, What do you do? I'm a storyteller. What do you do? I tell stories. Really? And that conversation goes on and on for a while, and on occasion, you get someone who'll lean over and say, yeah? Why do you do that? And this is what I tell them. There was once a professor who was much loved by all of his students, except for one young man who sat in the back of the room and shook his head every time the professor opened his mouth. One day, that young man cornered the professor as he was coming out of the classroom and said, "Look, professor, I gotta ask you one question. Every time I raise my hand in class and ask you a question, you never give me an answer. You just tell me a story. Why do you do that?" And the professor looked at the young man and he said, "Well, if I'm going to answer that question, I'm going to have to tell you a story." And this is the story he told. Truth and story lived right next door to each other in the same village, and they were the best of friends. Now, story, she went through the streets of that village, and everybody loved her. They loved to see her coming. They loved to stop and listen to whatever she had to say. Story had lots of friends. Truth, on the other hand, well, Truth went around stark naked. People didn't know what to do. They'd see Truth and they didn't know where to look. Finally, it got to the point when people saw Truth coming, well, they crossed the street, turned their backs, and walked in the other direction. Nobody wanted to be friends with Truth. And Truth, he grew sadder and sadder, until finally one day he went to his best friend Story and said, "Oh, what am I going to do? Nobody wants to talk to me." Well, Story, she looked Truth up and down, and she said, "You know what? You need some clothes. Come with me." And Story took Truth upstairs. She opened her closet door and she said, "I've got plenty of clothes. I'm sure you'll find something that you can wear." And Truth looked at all the things that were there. He set aside the elegant brocades and the fine velvets. He shook his head at the whimsical and the fripperies. And finally, Truth decided on a pair of black pants and a black shirt. And just before he left, he reached out and he grabbed himself a bright red feather boa. And Truth went down the stairs and out into the streets. And Truth found that people wanted to talk to him. They would come up. They would say, "How do you do?" They would listen to what he had to say. And after a while, Truth had almost as many friends as Story. Now, when the professor had finished telling that story to the young man, he said, "I'm the same way. I give you the answer. I just dress it up a little. Because after all, no one wants the naked truth." And that is the story.
Once there was a mother who knit sweaters for her daughter. She started even before her daughter was born, using, those safe colors, white and yellow and green. But once the daughter was born, the mother started knitting pink sweaters and purple sweaters too. As the daughter grew, so did the sweaters. Once the daughter learned how to speak, every time she got a new sweater, she said, "Thanks, Mommy. I like this one the best." When the daughter was 10, she asked, "Mommy, would you teach me how to knit?" "Oh, sweetie, I was hoping that you'd ask. I'd love to teach you how to knit." So the mother taught the daughter how to knit. The daughter first made sweaters for her dolls because they were small. But then she made sweaters for herself and her father and her brother, and then her boyfriends and her fiancé and her husband, and then her own children. But she never made a sweater for her mother. She thought of it once, but then quickly thought, no, whenever Mom sees a sweater that she wants, she just makes it for herself. But the mother kept on making sweaters for the daughter. The last sweater the mother made for the daughter was a red sweater with a pattern of raised hearts across the shoulders. Unfortunately, 6 months after the mother gave the sweater to the daughter, the mother died. But the daughter wore that sweater many, many times. And every time she wore it, she felt her mother's love. Eventually, however, the sweater got worn out. When the daughter realized that, she thought, no, I don't want to throw this away. This is the last sweater my mother made for me. Isn't there something I can do? So she looked and she thought, and then she smiled. I know. I'll take the sleeves off and use the good yarn from the sleeves to repair the holes in the body of it, and then I'll have a vest to wear. That's just what she did. The daughter wore that vest many, many times, and every time she wore it, she felt her mother's love. Eventually, however, the vest got worn out. When the daughter realized that, she thought, I don't want to throw this away. It's from the last sweater my mother made for me. Isn't there something I can do? She looked and she thought, and then she smiled. There's still a lot of good yarn left in there. I'll take the vest apart and see how much yarn I have, and I'll make something out of that. She ended up with a good-sized ball of yarn, and she made herself a scarf out of that. And she put that pattern of raised hearts all over that scarf. The daughter wore that scarf many, many times. And every time she wore it, she felt her mother's love. Eventually, however, even the scarf got worn out. When the daughter realized that, she thought, I don't want to throw this away. It's from the last sweater my mother made for me. Isn't there something I can do? She looked and she thought, she said, there's still a little bit of good yarn left here. I'll take the scarf all apart and make something from what the yarn that's left. Well, she only had a little ball of yarn this big. I can't make anything to wear out of that, but I can make a Christmas ornament. And out of that last little bit of ball of yarn, she made this ornament and put the pattern of the raised heart right in the middle of it. And she knew that whenever she saw that, she would feel her mother's love. But it wasn't Christmas, so she put the ornament away and noticed there was one last piece of yarn left, only this long. The daughter thought, now, I know it's foolish even to think of doing something with this little bit of yarn. But she looked and she thought, and then she smiled because she was a storyteller as well as a knitter. And from that last little bit of yarn, the daughter made this story. And she knew that whenever she told it, she would feel her mother's love.
So it takes place in the town of Chelm, and this is a traditional story. This story is about the wisest man in all of Chelm, Shlomo, the scientist. Yes, Shlomo, it was as if when God created him, that God poured all the wisdom of Helm into Shlomo's head. But he must have neglected other aspects because Shlomo was not a very attractive man. One Chelmite once said to Shlomo, "Shlomo, how is it that a brain like yours is in such a weak little body?" And Shlomo looked at him and replied, "I was born a beautiful boy. But the midwife, she made a mistake. She switched me with an ugly baby. I am not myself. I am the beautiful boy. He is the ugly one." Yes, Shlomo was a truly wise Chelmite. And one story that exemplifies his wisdom was when Helm needed a new cemetery. Because you see, Helm was originally a very small village, but it grew. And there came a time when the graveyard was full. And the Helmites knew that something must be done about this, because with a full graveyard, well, no one can die. And this is both rude and very inconvenient. So all of Helm was called to come to a council, to come together, to discuss what must be done. And it was of course decided that a new graveyard must be built. But where should it be? Well, the younger generation said that the new graveyard should be built on top of a nearby hill, because from this hill the dead would be able to hear the birds tweet in the morning, be able to look upon all of Helm, and there would be a nice river going by on one side. It would be a beautiful place to be dead. But the older generation said no, that this wouldn't work out, because the hill was so far away from the old cemetery, and once you were done walking through the old cemetery and visiting your relatives there, you would have to walk all the way to the hill and trek up all the way to the hill to visit your other relatives. No, this would not work. They said that the new cemetery must be right next to the old cemetery. And as the older generation, and thus closer to use the cemetery, their opinion won out. So it was decided that the new graveyard would be built right next to the old one. But how big should it be? Well, they couldn't go by the measurements of the old cemetery, because Helm was bigger now. They didn't know what to do. But Shlomo the scientist had an idea. And Shlomo said, "We will all go to the field, and we will all lie down next to each other. One man, one woman, one child to each plot. And I will measure it out, and then we will know exactly how big to make the new graveyard." Well, this was an ingenious idea. This was great. So the Helmites cheered, but Shlomo calmed them down and said, "But when we get older, we get bigger. To account for this, we will all wear our winter attire." So that's just what the Helmites did. They went to the field wearing all their winter clothing, all of their jackets and scarves and furs and hats. Everyone was dressed as if it was winter. And each person lay down next to one another. And Shlomo the scientist then went out and measured the entire thing. And when it was done, the Helmites cheered, because now they could build the new cemetery. Now people could be buried in a cemetery. This was great, and they celebrated. Everyone except for Shlomo the scientist. And this confused the Helmites, because after all, it was Shlomo's great idea. So the Helmites came to him and asked him what was wrong, and Shlomo replied, "You see, because I was the one to measure it, I do not have a grave myself." Well, this did not sit well with the Helmites. The Helmites were very kind folk, and it was decided that in honor of Shlomo's willingness to give up his own spot in the new cemetery, and for his great idea, it was decided that Shlomo would be the first one buried in the new cemetery. I still don't know how that worked out.
Let me just, my brother-in-law and his wife lived in New York City until 9/11. And when 9/11 came, they decided it really was time for them to leave New York City. They wanted to raise a family, so they left their place on Grove Street down in the village and they moved out to Rockland County. Well, so did a lot of their friends. They were all about that time in their life when they wanted to start families, so they all moved out to Rockland County, including their friend Stevie Mallet. Now, Stevie wasn't really interested in starting a family. All he had was his dog Buster, but he didn't want to be left behind. So Stevie moved out to Rockland County too, and he bought himself a house. Stevie bought a house right next to a retired couple, Salvatore and Carmela, right from Italy. Now you'd think that a party boy like Stevie Mallet and his little dog Buster wouldn't have a whole lot in common with Salvatore and Carmela. But that wasn't the case at all. Carmela, she worried about Stevie. I mean, there was Stevie. He had no wife. All he had was that dog Buster. You know how dogs are, chasing the mailman, digging holes in the backyard. So she would go over twice a week with a tray of lasagna and some eggplant parmesan. Now, Stevie, he worried about Salvatore. All the house chores, you know, climbing up on the ladder, cleaning out the leaders and gutters. So Stevie would go over and help Salvatore whenever he could. And they had another thing in common. They both raised rabbits. And they had a lot to talk about. Well, it turned out that Salvatore and Carmela decided to go down to Pennsylvania for a few days to visit their daughter. They needed someone to look after the rabbits. So who were they going to ask? They go right over and ask Stevie. Stevie says, no problem, I'll take care of the rabbits as if they were my own. So off go Salvatore and Carmela. Stevie takes care of the rabbits. On Friday night, Stevie came home. And he did what he did every Friday night. First thing he did was open the refrigerator door, take out a beer, open it up, start to drink it. Usually on Friday, Stevie didn't feel much like walking Buster the dog, so he would just open the back door and let Buster run. And there was Stevie, drinking his beer. And there was Buster, out in the backyard. And then Buster came over to Stevie. And when Stevie looked down, he saw something in Buster's mouth. He looked a little closer. It was a rabbit. Stevie bent down and he said, Buster, what did you do? And he took the rabbit out of Buster's mouth, and he knew it wasn't one of his. It was one of Carmela's. It was kind of dirty. It was really limp. He shook it. Nothing happened. So Stevie went over into the kitchen, he turned on the tap, he washed the rabbit, nothing happened. Stevie could not bring himself to tell Carmela that Buster had killed one of her rabbits. So he took that rabbit that he had tried to fluff up, went into the garage, opened one of the rabbit cages and stuck the dead rabbit in the back. Shut the cage. The next day, Salvatore and Carmela came home. Stevie was in the driveway when they arrived. Stevie waved when they got out of the car. They waved. Stevie said, how was it? Did you have a good time? Oh, we had a wonderful time. And Stevie went right into his house. A few minutes later, he heard a little knock on the door. He opened up the door. It was Salvatore. Salvatore came in. He and Stevie started to talk. After a while, Salvatore looked at Stevie. He said, you know, Stevie, Carmela really loves her rabbits. He said, I like rabbits. He said, I think they're cute. You know, they're little fluffy creatures with long ears and little round tails. But to be honest with you, Stevie, I can't tell one rabbit from the other. But not Carmela. Carmela, she knows every single rabbit in her hutch. She gives each one of them a name. She's got Peter Cottontail, Mr. McDonald. She's got Fluffy, Mopsy, Grumpy, Sneezy. She's got them all named. So, of course, you know, Stevie, the minute we get home, the first thing Carmela does is she goes out to talk to the rabbits. And I'm sitting in the kitchen, and in comes Carmela. She's got a dead rabbit in her hand. She looks at me. She goes, Salvatore, how could such a thing happen? Well, I want to comfort the poor woman. I look at her. I say, oh, Carmela, I don't know. It's the will of God. She said, no, Salvatore. It is not the will of God. This is Sneezy. Sneezy died the day before we went to Pennsylvania. I took Sneezy into the backyard. I dug a hole for Sneezy. I said a prayer to St. Francis and I buried Sneezy. So you tell me, Salvador, how did Sneezy get up out of the ground and into the back of one of our cages? And Salvatore looked at Stevie, and he asked him the very same question. So, Stevie, how did Sneezy get into the back of one of our cages? And as far as I know, Stevie never came up with a good answer to that question. And that's the story of Sneezy.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round,